The hospital's automatic glass doors slid open, and the freezing November wind cut straight through my thin nursing scrubs. My key did not work. I turned it once, twice, 3 times, until the cheap metal nearly snapped in my hand. Inside the house, the hallway light was completely dark, but the scent of bleach and stale air drifted through the gaps. On the porch, right next to the mat, sat a single cardboard box filled with my old clothes and a photograph of my parents. Tucked under the box flap was a handwritten note from my husband, Austin. I filed a temporary custody claim based on your documented mental instability. If you touch this door or call my father, you will never see the baby. My hand flew to my stomach, where my 7-month unborn child kicked against my ribs, and my vision blurred into a terrifying shade of gray. To understand how a wife, a prospective mother, and a dedicated healthcare worker could be locked out of her own life in a single evening, we must look back to where the silence first began. 5 months before that freezing night, the suburban house on Elmwood Drive was already a tomb of quiet isolation. Every evening at 6 o'clock, the heavy oak front door would click open. Austin would step inside, drop his leather briefcase onto the hardwood floor with a dull thud, and hang up his coat without saying a single word. I would stand in the kitchen, the steam from the chicken pot, roast warming my face, waiting for a greeting that never came. He did not look at me. He did not ask about my 12-hour shift as a certified nursing assistant at the St. Jude nursing home. When I served dinner, he would stare right through me, clicking his tongue as he moved his fork around the plate. This was the art of his cold violence. He did not raise his hand. He simply erased my presence. If I asked a question about our budget or the upcoming winter utilities, his jaw would tighten. He would sigh heavily, lean across the table, and speak in a low, patronizing tone that made my chest tighten. "Hazel, your mind is clearly playing tricks on you again. Leave the logistics to me before you give yourself another panic attack." Over the weeks, his gaslighting became a thick fog. I began to double-check the locks, doubt my own memory, and feel like a ghost haunting the corners of my own home. Then came the financial invisible cage. First, the joint bank account card was declined at the grocery store while I was buying milk. When I called Austin from the checkout lane, the background noise of his office was loud, but his voice was ice. He told me he had moved the funds to a more secure investment pipeline and that he would handle the bills from now on. My hard-earned wages from the nursing home were redirected into a new account that I could not see or access. He put me on a strict, humiliating cash allowance, doling out $20 bills on Sunday evenings like I was a child. The true cruelty unfolded when the morning sickness began. I discovered I was pregnant in early June. I held the positive test in the quiet bathroom, tears of joy and terror streaming down my cheeks. But when I showed the test to Austin, his face did not soften. He simply nodded, turned back to his laptop, and adjusted his glasses. A week later, he and his new financial consultant, Chloe Vance, began spending long hours in our home office. Chloe was a sharp woman with a cold smile and a perfume that smelled heavily of expensive jasmine. Whenever I entered the room with tea, their voices would immediately drop to a whisper. By August, the trap snapped shut. I drove to my prenatal checkup at the community clinic, eager to hear my baby's heartbeat. At the reception desk, the clerk slid my medical card through the scanner. The machine let out a sharp, negative beep. The clerk looked up with a sympathetic but firm expression. "Mrs. Brooks, your primary insurance coverage was terminated by the policyholder 3 months ago." The air left my lungs completely. Austin had single-handedly canceled my health care while I was 11 weeks pregnant. I stood in the sterile lobby, surrounded by the smell of rubbing alcohol, realizing I had no safety net. When the locks were changed in November, my world broke. With a cardboard box in my arms and no insurance, my pride prevented me from calling my parents in West Virginia. I had caved into Austin's initial demands years ago against their wishes, and my stubbornness turned into a wall of shame. I could not bear to hear them say I had chosen wrong. Instead, I took my old sedan and drove into the dark, rainy streets of Columbus. For 3 nights, I slept in the back seat of my car, wrapping myself in a thin nursing blanket, listening to the rain beat against the metal roof. My ankles swelled, and my lower back burned with a constant, deep ache. On the 4th morning, out of pure survival instinct, I knocked on the back alley door of Lou's Diner at 6 o'clock. The owner, Linda Cho, smelled of fried onions and fresh coffee. She looked at my swollen eyes, my uniform, and my prominent belly. She did not ask a single question. She pointed toward a tiny, windowless dry storage room at the back of the kitchen. Inside was an old folding cot with a flannel blanket and rows of canned tomatoes lining the metal shelves. That room became my sanctuary, and the heavy tray of water glasses became my daily reality. I hid in the heat of the kitchen, blending into the background, holding my stomach, and preparing for the long winter ahead. The sharp jangle of the bell above the front door of Lou's Diner cut through the thick evening hum. It was a Friday night in late November, and the air inside smelled of sputtering fryer oil, burnt coffee grounds, and the heavy sweetness of maple syrup. In the corner booth, on the intersection of Broad and High Street, an old man sat alone. It was Gavin Brooks. For 31 years, he and his late wife, Margaret, had occupied that exact laminated table every single week. Now, 3 years after her passing, the routine was his only anchor. He stared down at his untouched plate of meatloaf, his right hand trembling slightly as he tried to grip his water glass. The dizzy spells had been worsening for 3 months, hitting him like sudden, disorienting waves. I emerged from the kitchen doors carrying a heavy plastic tray loaded with water glasses. My feet, stuffed into worn, non-slip shoes, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, the white apron tied twice around my 7-month pregnant belly felt suffocatingly tight. As I set a glass down at the table next to the corner booth, I wiped a strand of damp hair from my forehead and turned toward the light. Gavin's eyes locked onto my face. I saw his jaw drop. I saw the water glass slip from his fingers, spilling cold droplets across the table. "Hazel," he whispered, his voice cracking under the noise of the diner. Panic flared hot in my chest. Austin's threats echoed in my mind like a siren. I turned instantly, my swollen ankles straining, and pushed through the swinging kitchen doors to hide. Gavin did not stop. The heavy doors slammed open behind me, letting in the loud hiss of the industrial dishwasher and the sharp clang of metal pans. He followed my slow, heavy footsteps all the way to the dim, dry storage alcove at the very back. I pressed my back hard against a cold steel shelf lined with heavy cans of crushed tomatoes, my hands instinctively wrapping around my belly. "Hazel, look at me," Gavin said, his breathing ragged, his hands open and raised at his sides. "I am not here to hurt you. What is happening? Austin told us you walked away. He said you took the money and left." The tears came then, hot and uncontrollable, washing down my flour-dusted cheeks. Linda Cho, the diner owner, stepped out from the prep station, her face calm but her eyes sharp as flints. She looked at Gavin's expensive coat, then at my trembling frame. Without a word, she untied her apron, hung it on a rusty wall hook, and gestured toward a small wooden door. "In here," she said flatly. The storage room was tiny and suffocating. It smelled of old cardboard, dried time, and damp wool. A single blue milk crate stood upside down next to a narrow folding cot, serving as a makeshift nightstand for my prenatal vitamins and a tube of cheap hand cream. Gavin stepped inside, his large frame filling the space, his eyes tracking the stark emptiness of the room. Then, his gaze fell beneath the cot. Tucked next to the baseboard was a clear plastic bag containing my cream-colored satin wedding heels. The sight seemed to strike him like a physical blow. "She has been sleeping here since mid-November," Linda said from the doorway, her voice stripping away any comfort. "Knocked on my back door at dawn, soaking wet, asking for kitchen work. She was sleeping in her sedan before that." Gavin sank onto the single plastic chair, his face turning an ash-gray color. "In the winter, while carrying my grandchild." I sat on the edge of the cot, my spine rigid despite the deep exhaustion in my bones. I opened my worn ledger notebook and held it against my chest like a shield. "Austin changed the locks while I was at the clinic," I told him, my voice tight and level. "He canceled my health insurance in May. He took my wages. He told me if I ever came to you, he would use a fraudulent medical report to prove I was unfit and take my baby away. I had nowhere to go, Gavin. He told everyone I left because he is an expert at rewriting reality." Gavin hid his face in his rough palms, his shoulders shaking silently. "God forgive me," he breathed into his hands. I believed him. He sat at my table, and he cried. "There is something worse," I said, leaning forward so our knees almost touched. I opened the ledger to the entries from September. My training as a nurse saved me from total blindness. I watched his habits. I smelled the chemical bitterness in the kitchen counter trash. Austin and Chloe Vance are dissolving extra tablets of your amlodipine into the dark roast coffee he brings you every single morning. Gavin raised his head, his dark eyes wide with sudden, absolute terror. The hand tremors, the morning dizziness, the cognitive fog. "It is not old age, Gavin," I whispered, pointing to the dates in the ledger. "They are systematically overloading your kidneys. They are trying to make your death look like a natural decline before the new fiscal year." The silence in the room became absolute, heavy and cold. Gavin stood up, the cheap plastic chair scraping loudly against the linoleum flooring. The wealthy logistics tycoon was gone. In his place stood a father facing the monstrous reality of his own creation. He reached out, his trembling hand gently touching the worn cover of my notebook. "No more," Gavin said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that shook with clean, cold rage. "You are packing your things right now. You are leaving this kitchen tonight. We are going to protect this baby. And then I am going to tear down every single lie my son has ever told." An hour later, the headlights of Gavin's sedan cut through the dark parking lot of the Fairfield Inn on Airport Drive. He paid the front desk clerk in cash using a fake name, ensuring no digital trail could lead Austin to us. I stood inside the warm, sterile hotel room, the smell of clean linen finally replacing the diner grease. Through the window, I watched Gavin's car pull away into the freezing night. He was driving back to the empty house on Elmwood Drive to search for the pieces Austin had hidden. Late that night, under the pale light of a desk lamp in Austin's old childhood bedroom, Gavin pulled open the deep bottom drawer that always stuck on the left side. Beneath a dusty spelling bee ribbon, his fingers brushed against a crumpled white envelope. Inside was the grainy, black and white sonogram image of B. Liam from July, alongside my unmailed letter detailing the 3 times Austin had turned me away from Gavin's front door. Gavin pressed the grainy photograph against his chest, sitting alone in the dark room, listening to the winter wind rattle the glass, finally seeing the true cost of his empty chair. The morning light over Elmwood Drive was a dull, heavy gray. At exactly 7 o'clock, Austin's German sedan pulled into the driveway with a soft mechanical thunk. He walked through the back door, carrying a paper cup holder with 2 large coffees from Rosie's Roast. The steam from the plastic lids smelled rich, dark, and normal. Gavin sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded neatly on the wood. "You look tired, Dad," Austin said, sliding a cup across the table. His eyes tracked the cup, watching it like a card placed face down on a green felt table. Gavin reached out, letting his right hand shake with a heavy, exaggerated tremor. He brought the cup to his lips, paused, and set it back down. "My stomach is sour today, son. I will save it for later." A tiny, sharp flicker of frustration crossed Austin's face before he recovered his calm smile. As soon as Austin left the driveway, Gavin stood up and poured the entire dark liquid down the kitchen sink, watching the brown foam vanish into the drain. 2 hours later, Gavin stood inside the private office of Dr. James Howell on Brighton Road. The room smelled of cedar, wood, rubbing alcohol, and old paper. Dr. Howell extracted 3 vials of blood from Gavin's arm with a cold, metallic needle. Then, he ran a portable chemical analysis on the coffee sample Gavin had brought in a sealed plastic bag. The machine hummed steadily, then spat out a white thermal paper slip. Dr. Howell looked up, his shoulders tightening under his white coat. "The sample contains 15 to 20 milligrams of amlodipine," the doctor said, his voice flat and grave. "Your prescription is only 5 milligrams. This concentration is an overdose. It mimics natural physical decline, but it is crushing your kidneys. Hal, this is deliberate poisoning, and I am legally bound to report this to the authorities." Gavin nodded slowly, his face like stone. "Report it, James. Call Detective Carter Hayes. Tell him I am ready to be the bait." Within the hour, Detective Carter Hayes opened a secret criminal file at the Columbus Police Department. The plan was locked into place. Gavin would continue to accept the morning coffee visits, acting increasingly confused, weak, and frail to keep Austin complacent while the police monitored the financial transfers and gathered direct evidence. The suspended rhythm of the trap lasted for days, but the quiet broke on a freezing Wednesday night. Inside room 214 of the Fairfield Inn, the air was warm but tense. Suddenly, a sharp, white-hot pain ripped through Hazel's lower back. She gasped, her fingers digging into the stiff hotel bed sheets. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. Her water broke, soaking the carpet with a sudden splash. The baby was coming early, at only 28 weeks of gestation. She grabbed the phone, her voice tight and trembling with agony. "Gavin, it's happening. The contractions are 3 minutes apart. It's too fast." Gavin's second phone buzzed instantly on his nightstand. It was a text from the police surveillance unit outside the hotel. Subject Austin just left his downtown apartment, driving fast on Interstate 270. He has traced the general hotel location. "Move now." Gavin roared orders through the receiver. "Lock the deadbolt. Hazel, do not open the door until Roy knocks 3 times. Roy, Gavin's loyal driver, slammed the brakes of his large black SUV at the hotel's side entrance just as Gavin arrived in his own truck. Gavin took the stairs 2 at a time, his old injured knee screaming with every impact. He knocked 3 times. The door flew open. Hazel stood there, her face white and slick with sweat, her knuckles white as she gripped the frame during a wave of pain. "Let's go," Gavin said, throwing a blanket over her shoulders. He guided her down the dark back stairwell, bypassing the bright fluorescent lobby entirely. Just as they reached the parking lot, the bright high beams of Austin's silver sedan swept across the wet asphalt, entering the main driveway. Hance was searching the rows of parked cars. "Roy, cut the lights." Gavin barked, sliding into the passenger seat, as Roy threw Hazel into the back. Roy slammed the accelerator down. The massive SUV surged forward in total darkness, its tires screeching against the ice. Roy swerved hard into the narrow, unlit service alley behind the hotel, completely cutting off the silver sedan's field of vision. Austin's car sped past the main entrance, completely blind to the black shadow slipping out onto the main road. The SUV tore through the snowy streets toward Ohio Health Riverside Hospital. In the back seat, Hazel groaned, her eyes shut tight, her breathing coming in short, rhythmic gasps as another contraction took hold. The red neon sign of the hospital's service gate loomed ahead. The gate slid open automatically on a prearranged security code, swallowing the vehicle into the underground ambulance bay. Dr. Susan Park was already waiting under the buzzing white lights of the bay, with a metal gurney and 2 nurses. She took one look at Hazel's pale face and dilated eyes. "We are moving to the restricted wing right now," Dr. Park said, her voice sharp with clinical authority. "No patient information leaves this floor. Austin Brooks is officially barred from the building." The heavy double doors swung shut with a loud, rubbery click, leaving Gavin alone in the sterile corridor, the smell of antiseptic burning his nostrils as the silent waiting began. The steady, rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor inside the neonatal intensive care unit was the only sound in the dim room. The air smelled faintly of medical-grade sanitizer and warm plastic. Behind the thick glass of the incubator lay baby Liam, weighing just 3.5 pounds. His skin was a translucent red, and tiny plastic tubes connected his frail chest to the hum of the breathing machine. Hazel stood over the glass enclosure, her eyes reflecting the pale blue light of the monitor. Inside her chest, a profound shift took place. The soft, heavy tears of a victim dried up, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. She looked at her son's tiny fists clenching the air, fighting for every single breath. "No more," she whispered to herself. The days of weeping in the dark storage room, of swallowing Austin's cold insults, and of waiting for someone to save her, were officially over. She realized a fundamental truth. No one was going to hand her a happy life. She had to build it with her own 2 hands. She was no longer an invisible wife. She was a mother with a purpose. Her transformation was immediate, practical, and deliberate. The very next morning, sitting on the small plastic chair next to the incubator, Hazel opened her laptop. She did not ask Gavin for money, and she did not wait for a charity handout. She used her own modest savings from her years as a CNA to enroll in an intensive online certification program for healthcare administration. While the machines hummed, she memorized medical laws, budget structures, and hospital management protocols. She studied late into the night, her eyes wide with a new kind of hunger. She also took control of her physical reality. She walked into the hospital restroom, took a pair of surgical scissors, and cut her long, split-ended hair into a sharp, chin-length bob. The mirror reflected a new woman. Her jaw was set, and the old, fearful hesitation in her eyes had vanished, replaced by the steady, piercing gaze of an administrator. She opened a new, secure bank account at a local credit union, establishing a strict, independent budget for her future apartment. Every dollar from her remaining nursing shifts was tracked down to the exact penny in a new, digital ledger. A week later, Gavin stood beside her in the dim light of the NICU. Through the clear plastic wall of the incubator, the nurse gently turned baby Liam onto his side. Hazel pointed a steady finger toward the infant's left shoulder. There, etched clearly against the red skin, was a small brownish-pink oval mark about the size of an adult thumbprint. Gavin gasped, his hand flying to his own left shoulder, where an identical mark lay hidden beneath his wool shirt. "The Brooks family mark," Gavin breathed, his eyes filling with sudden light. Hazel looked at him, her voice calm and absolute. "Margaret showed me the old family albums before she passed. She told me Austin never inherited it, as if he lacked the warmth of the Brooks blood. But Liam has it. The bloodline is unbroken, Gavin. The family continues through him." She stood straight, her new short hair framing a face that held no more fear. She signed the final application for a clinic manager position, right there on the incubator table, her signature bold, dark, and final. The early morning sunlight cut through the kitchen window of the house on Elmwood Drive, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The air in the room was completely motionless, heavy with the weight of an impending storm that had been brewing for months. Gavin Brooks sat perfectly upright in his usual wooden chair at the head of the long dining table. His face was a mask of cold sandstone, carved by decades of hard work and recent, unspeakable heartbreak. His spine was unyielding, refusing to let the heavy exhaustion in his bones slow him down. In the exact center of the table sat a thick brown accordion folder, sealed tight with a heavy, dust-covered rubber band. To his right, a white ceramic mug filled with fresh, pure coffee let out a thin, twisting plume of clean, nutty steam. The aroma was rich and untouched. He had not let a single drop of Austin's morning delivery pass his lips today. The liquid in the paper cup from Rosie's roast had already been discarded down the drain hours ago. The time for pretense was dead, and the silence in the house was absolute. At exactly 7:53 a.m., the back door handle rattled. The heavywood swung open with a familiar, mechanical click that resonated sharply through the quiet house. Austin Brooks stepped into the room, his long gray wool coat sweeping against the doorframe as he entered. He carried a fresh paper cup, holder balanced easily in his right hand, containing the morning's dark roast. He looked completely rested. His dark hair was still damp from a morning shower, his chin was cleanly shaven, and his smooth, untroubled expression showed no signs of guilt or hesitation. He walked with the easy, arrogant posture of a man who believed he owned the world, entirely unaware that the floor beneath his feet had already turned to sand. Then, Austin's eyes caught the accordion folder. His footsteps stopped instantly, the leather soles of his shoes squeaking against the wood floor. He looked at the folder, then at his father's perfectly steady, unmoving hands, and then back at the folder. The smooth, untroubled mask vanished from his face in a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened, his chest hitched, and his shoulders went completely rigid under his expensive wool coat. The rich scent of the dark roast coffee suddenly felt suffocating in the narrow space of the kitchen. "Sit down, Austin," Gavin said. The words were short, flat, and heavy as iron blocks. They carried no anger, no theatrical volume, just the absolute authority of a man who had reached the end of his endurance. Austin pulled out the heavy wooden chair opposite his father, his movements slow, cautious, and incredibly tense. The easy confidence had evaporated, replaced by the jagged caution of a cornered animal. He did not look his father in the eye. Instead, his gaze remained glued to the brown folder between them. "You look better this morning, Dad," Austin said, his voice dropping an octave as he tried to force a calm tone into the room. "I thought you said you had a brutal night on the phone. I thought the dizziness had returned." "I lied," Gavin said, his voice level and chillingly quiet as he stared directly into his son's dark, shifting eyes. "I have been doing a lot of that lately. Practicing. You taught me how useful a lie can be when you want to keep someone blind." Gavin reached forward, his large, calloused fingers snapping the heavy rubber band off the folder with a sharp thwack that made Austin flinch. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, Gavin slid the first thick stack of papers across the polished wood, the white sheets slapping loudly against the table. "This is a 43-page forensic financial audit completed by Paula Hines," Gavin said, his voice cutting through the hum of the refrigerator. 14 separate wire transfers over 18 months. Every single one authorized by your digital signature. $1.2 million systematically drained from our primary logistics operating accounts and moved into 3 shell LLCs registered in the state of Ohio. the registered agent for those accounts, a woman named Sandra Cole, the 71-year-old mother of your financial consultant, Chloe Vance. Austin's face drained of color, turning the shade of old chalk under the white kitchen lights. His lips parted, but his throat was completely dry. No sound came out. Gavin did not pause. He slid the next document forward, a crisp white sheet bearing a medical letterhead. This is the medical toxicology panel from Dr. James Howell, drawn from my own veins and cross-referenced with the liquid samples we pulled from this kitchen. Amlodipine concentration in my bloodstream at 4 times the maximum therapeutic limit. The chemical analysis confirms the tablets were crushed and dissolved into the dark roast coffee you brought me every single morning for 10 weeks. It mimics natural physical decline, Austin. It looks like a stroke or age-related dementia on a standard coroner's report. It was supposed to crush my kidneys before the winter audit, wasn't it? Austin fell back against the wooden slats of his chair, his hands flying up to cover his face as a low, ragged gasp left his throat. His fingers trembled against his skin. Gavin slid the final paper forward, a document with a bright blue corporate stamp. And here is the digital signature on the life insurance amendment. $15 million payable upon my accidental death or sudden organ failure, redirected entirely to yourself. It was filed the exact same week my morning hand tremors began. Look at the dates. Austin. They match the coffee entries down to the hour. Do you have a question, or should I keep reading? I didn't know. Austin stuttered into his palms, his head shaking violently as his entire body suffered a sudden, ugly collapse. The arrogant executive had vanished. He looked small, desperate, and broken. Chloe said the doses were safe. She said it would just make you tired. She said you would be compliant enough to sign the vendor transitions without asking questions. I swear to God, Dad, I didn't know she wanted you dead. I didn't know the kidneys would fail. Don't. Gavin cut him off, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried more weight than a shout. Do not insult your mother's memory by using God's name in this kitchen. I found your 19-year-old note in the bottom drawer of your childhood desk last night, Austin. The boy who wrote that he wanted to grow up and build things that last. I kept that note for 2 decades because I thought it meant something. What happened to that boy? When did you decide that $15 million was worth more than my life? Austin flinched as if he had been struck across the face. His hands dropped from his skin, and his forehead hit the wooden surface of the table with a dull thud, a sharp, choked sob finally breaking from his chest. Your son, Liam Brooks, was born at 2:43 yesterday morning. Gavin said, the words falling into the room like heavy stone blocks. He weighs 3.5 pounds. He is currently hooked up to a ventilator inside a plastic box at Riverside Hospital, fighting for every single breath because his mother was forced to work 10-hour shifts on swollen feet and sleep in a freezing storage room because of your lies. He has the Brooks family mark on his shoulder. Austin, the mark you never inherited. The family continues through him, but you will never touch him. Gavin raised his head and looked toward the hallway. Detective Walsh, he called out. From the shadows of the back hallway, the heavy click of boots sounded against the wood floor. Detective Karen Walsh stepped into the kitchen light, a gold shield gleaming on her belt. 2 uniformed officers moved in right behind her, their heavy leather utility belts clinking with the distinct metallic sound of handcuffs and radios. Austin Brooks, Detective Walsh said, her voice clear, professional, and entirely devoid of pity. You are under arrest for financial fraud, grand theft by deception, and criminal poisoning. Stand up, keep your hands where we can see them, and turn around. Austin stood up like a hollow shell, his limbs moving automatically, offering no resistance as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. The metal was cold against his skin. He looked back at his father one last time over the untouched folders, his eyes red, wet, and completely vacant. Did you ever actually trust me, Dad? He whispered, his voice cracking. I loved you every single day of your life, Gavin said, a single heavy tear tracking down his lined cheek, though his gaze never wavered. Even today, even while I sat here, waiting for the police to take you away, that is what makes this the hardest thing I have ever done. The front door slammed shut with a heavy rumble, shaking the kitchen windows as the officers led Austin down the concrete driveway toward the waiting police cruiser. The red and blue lights flashed silently against the kitchen cabinets for a moment before the car pulled away from the curb. Detective Walsh walked back into the kitchen, dropping a secondary manila file onto the counter. Chloe Vance was taken into custody at John Glenn International Airport at 7:40 a.m., she reported, her tone businesslike. She was already at the departure gate for a one-way flight to Miami. We seized her laptop, her cell phones, and her checked bags. The documentation Hazel gathered in that ledger allowed us to get the warrant before she could cross state lines. This case is completely airtight, Mr. Brooks. Gavin nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the empty space across the table. Thank you, Karen. Go do what needs to be done. The front door clicked closed once more, leaving the old house in a profound, heavy silence. The air smelled of clean coffee and cold paper. The toxic presence finally cleared from the room. 3 weeks later, the final blow was delivered not in a kitchen, but inside the sterile, wood-paneled chambers of the Columbus family court. The room was quiet, lit by high windows that looked out over the gray city skyline. Austin Brooks sat in a bright orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled to his waist, guarded by 2 county deputies. Hazel sat across the room, her new short hair framing a face that held no trace of the woman who had wept in the diner's storage room. She looked at him with absolute calm detachment. Based on the overwhelming criminal evidence of attempted murder, financial ruin, and deliberate domestic abuse, the family court judge did not hesitate. He brought his heavy wooden gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack. The decree was absolute: termination of parental rights. Austin Brooks was legally stripped of his status as a father permanently. In the eyes of the law, he no longer existed in the life of baby Liam. He was a legal stranger to his own flesh and blood. Austin's head fell back, his shoulders slumping as the reality of his total isolation settled into his bones. Gavin stood right next to Hazel, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder. As the deputies led the shackled man back to the holding cells to begin his 17-year prison sentence, Gavin turned to the corporate attorneys waiting at the back of the courtroom. With a steady hand, Gavin signed the final execution papers for an irrevocable trust. Every single warehouse, every multi-million-dollar logistics contract, the real estate portfolio, and the entire $68 million legacy of Brooks Freight was transferred permanently and unconditionally into the exclusive ownership of Hazel Brooks and her son, Liam. Austin had plotted to erase Hazel and kill his father for $15 million. Instead, the legal architecture of the Brooks empire turned against him, erasing his name from the family lineage, stripping him of his freedom, and leaving him completely bankrupt inside a concrete cell. He had sought total control. Instead, he was left with absolute nothingness. The soft, amber light of a late April afternoon flooded the backyard of the house on Elmwood Drive, painting the wooden fence in a warm, golden wash. The air smelled of fresh rain, cut grass, and the smoky sweetness of charcoal from the barbecue grill. Near the property line, the young maple tree was no longer bare. Its new leaves were tiny, delicate, and unreservedly green, trembling softly in the gentle spring breeze. For the first time in 3 long years, the heavy, suffocating shadow over this home had completely dissolved, replaced by a quiet, rhythmic peace. In the center of the lawn, Doug and Patty Sutton, Hazel's parents, were busy setting up the patio table. Doug's deep, rumbling laughter echoed through the yard as he swapped old truck-driving stories with Frank Delgado. Frank stood tall in a clean flannel shirt, his posture proud, and his gaze steady as the newly appointed director of operations for Brooks Freight. Patty was near the kitchen window, humming a soft tune as she washed fresh strawberries, the cool water splashing musically against the metal sink. Nearby, Gavin Brooks sat in a wide wicker chair, his once trembling hands now perfectly still as he cradled a sleeping baby Liam in his lap. The infant was 5 months old, chubby-cheeked, and breathing with a deep, healthy rhythm, a tiny tuft of dark hair catching the golden sun. Hazel Brooks stood on the back porch, her hand resting lightly against the smooth white railing. She wore a sharp, tailored navy blazer and dark slacks, the professional uniform of her new role as the Director of Human Resources and Healthcare Administration for the entire Brooks Freight empire. Her short, chin-length bob shifted slightly as she tilted her head to watch her family. Her skin looked radiant under the warm sky, and her shoulders were square, free from the invisible weight that had crushed them for years. Inside her chest, the air was clean and light. She looked out at the bustling, happy yard and searched her soul for the old familiar sting of pain, but she found absolutely nothing. The bitter memories of the cold dinners, the changed locks, and the dark storage room at Lou's Diner had lost their power over her. She felt a profound, quiet liberation. She realized she harbored no more hatred, no lingering resentment, and no anger toward Austin or the darkness of the past. The ultimate act of forgiveness had not been for the man who broke his vows, but for herself. She forgave the younger version of Hazel, who had allowed herself to become invisible. She had stepped out of the tomb of victimhood and taken full responsibility for her own joy. The afternoon sun hit its peak, casting a brilliant, shimmering sheet of gold across the entire lawn. Hazel took a deep, clear breath of the crisp spring air, feeling the cool wind against her face. She smiled a genuine, radiant smile, a smile born of survival, triumphed intellect, and absolute independence. She was no longer a shadow in someone else's house. She was the architect of her own destiny, standing tall, completely free, and fiercely proud in the beautiful light of her own golden hour. Gavin looked up from his chair, his eyes meeting hers across the grass with a silent, grateful nod. Hazel stepped off the porch and walked down into the warm grass, ready to join the family she had saved. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. Please like, share, and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Hope to see you on the next page.